Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm very pleased to be joined by Brunella Rosa, CEO and Head of Research. Uh, Again, a lot of things going on in the world. The sort of ceaseless torrent of geopolitics, macroeconomics doesn't stop. This week, we wanted to take a look back and look at some sort of overlooked aspects of the geostrategic competition we see today, particularly the role of non-aligned countries.
Mhm.
Most of the world, effectively population-wise, lives in a number of these non-aligned countries or these BRICS countries. And maybe let's start off by talking about Brazil, Brunello, because Lula, has just become president and has overthrown the incumbent Jair Bolsonaro, and he's slightly tweaked, to say the least, Brazil's policy towards Russia. What were those modifications, and what do you think sort of led that foreign policy shift?
So you're right in the sense that Bolsonaro already in the last few months of his presidency decided not to align itself with the sanctions of the West. In his case, the position towards Russian aggression over Ukraine was, I would say, even a bit ambiguous. And that has changed with the arrival of Lula, the very narrow victory that we discussed a few weeks ago. So Lula does condemn kind of resolutely the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but it continues the policy initiated by his arch enemy, the predecessor Bolsonaro, in not applying sanctions of the West against Russia. The reasons are multiple. Clearly, there are economic ties between Russia and Brazil that it's complicated to cut. There is cooperation in the space and military technology, in telecommunications. These are all sectors whereby once there is a cooperation in place, it's very hard to get out of it. These are multi-year contracts. These are long-term investments. These are research projects that have been going on for years and are supposed to carry on for several more years. So getting out of these situations is very much complicated. And actually, the Brazilian president has signed a contract with Russia on to buy anti-craft system from Russia when Ivanov was president. So again, when you have this kind of military cooperation, it's very hard to get out of this contract.
Right. And there's a wild card here, the wild card of China. Obviously, sort of as BRICS countries, Brazil and China have sort of an intimate economic relationship, like most of the developing countries. How do you think that might play a factor in Brazil's relationship towards Russia?
Yeah, that's a further complication because Brazil has strong ties with Russia as well. First of all, sorry, with China as well. First of all, uh, the export of commodities from Brazil to China, like from lots of other Latin American countries, is big business for Brazil, and also is absolutely crucial for China. In fact, recently, the Chinese authorities have updated the list of approved uh, corn exporters from Brazil, and that would increase the export from Brazil to China at the time in which the exports from Ukraine and from the US have diminished for geopolitical reasons. Ukraine, because we know there's a war, US, because there's this ongoing how can I say, balkanization, global supply chains, and polarization of the world we discussed several times. So now that Russia and China are linked together, for Brazil getting out of this relationship with Russia on the one hand, we discussed, with China on the other hand, we also discussed, is extremely complicated.
I see. And there's another country that comes to mind, India, who's both historically but also in the current conflict try to teeter this line between a particularly non-aligned country trying really hard to sort of very selectively, based on its own interests, choose between the Western Bloc or the Soviet bloc. And we see some of that sort of historical patterns reproducing today. What has India's policy been so far in this?
Yeah, so I would say that what we point out in this week column is exactly this. We discussed what India is doing, and we repeat in this occasion, which is trying to remain in the middle between China and the US, not choosing between the two. And we know how complicated this is because India is part of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue with Australia, Japan, and the US, while at the same time being part of BRICS, clearly with Russia and China. So it's actually one of the main components of that grouping. Uh, and we know that during Cold War One, Cold War between US and Soviet Union, they tended to side more with the Soviet Union. And so now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they've also tended to side more with Russia, with the West, also because they got very good deals in terms of oil import, and we know how important it is for India to have the kind of import. But at the same time, we know that there are increasing tensions between India and China, given even a recent military exchange in the Himalayas a couple of years ago. So, but Russia and China, as we discussed, are together. So India needs to find kind of a balance between these two opposing positions between Russia and China, and along with US and China. So India has the size in terms of economic activity and population to try to hedge its bets if you want. So remain in the middle, see how it goes, not committing to one side or the other for as long as possible. We said in our publications that eventually India might be forced to choose between the two sides. And then at that point, we will see whether being a democracy prevails, in which case it will probably choose the US camp, or being a country with a more authoritarian regime prevails, in which case probably will go towards Russia and China. And so the question that we ask ourselves is whether Brazil can replicate the same strategy of India.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly the question. I mean, how can Brazil replicate the strategy of India? It's obviously a different size, a different continent, a different political environment, and it also represents what previously used to be very much the backyard of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, will the United States really let Brazil follow an India-like policy in this conflict?
So that's the point. So Brazil doesn't have the size that India has. We are talking about in terms of the economy, 1.6 trillion Brazil versus 3.1 trillion India. In terms of population, Brazil is barely 200 million people, so 0.2 trillion if you want, while India is 1.4 trillion. So the size is different, geographical location is different. So try to remain in equilibrium, so to speak, between US and China will be complicated. Brazil is also part, a big constituents of Latin America, but as you said, the US has considered his own backyard for so many decades, which is also the reason why the Yankees, so to speak, are hated in Latin America, because they have messed in the region for way too long, in their opinion. We remember the military coup in the 70s that were somehow instigated or protected or tolerated by the US. And this is something that clearly Latin American people don't forget. At the same time, for China, it would be hard to give up such an important ally in the BRICS area, to the point that they've actually invited Argentina to join together with Saudi Arabia, the dialogue, the BRICS dialogue, so that now they have constituted what we have called the EMG7, sort of G7 country, BRICS plus Argentina and Saudi Arabia. And while Saudi Arabia is clear because of its oil reserves, Argentina is slightly less clear. But when you put together with Brazil, you understand that having the BRI reaching out to LATAM with the two major countries being part of it, geostrategically, it makes a huge difference. So neither side, not the US, nor neither China, will want to give up Brazil so easily. Brazil may try to remain in the middle for as long as possible. Again, I'm thinking that eventually it doesn't have the size to afford to remain in the middle, and eventually would be forced to choose. I would say that under Bolsonaro would probably go more towards the China-Russia camp. And the Lula, for as long as it lasts, he would probably try to orbitate more in the Western Hemisphere, not as much the US, but in general towards the democracies of the West. But who knows what happens after Lula, who's is a third term and already quite advanced in terms of age, so it cannot project his influence indefinitely, and eventually new leadership will come up, and we'll see what kind of leadership it is and what kind of geostrategic position we choose for Brazil in coming years.
I see. It kind of reifies that sort of very old narrative of these developing countries essentially becoming proxy grounds for great power competition. But another interesting, perhaps more newer trend is, increasingly this great power competition is driven by economic imperatives. It's driven by, a country's necessity to import commodities from another. In Ukraine, we see the importance of energy and gas. And those economic imperatives are coming back in a way that we hadn't seen for so long, that we thought we lived in a sort of more, socially constructed world where countries would, fight with each other based on ideology and values. It sort of comes back to the same realist imperatives at the end of the day. So that's a very interesting shift to see, and I'm sure one that we'll be on the lookout for in the sort of months and years to come. But as always, thank you so much for your time and insight, Brunello.
Thank you very much. Until next time.